What if the life you risked everything for turned you away the moment they saw your greatest blessing? If you've ever been judged for the baggage you carry, the beautiful, innocent baggage that sleeps in your arms, this story will speak to your heart. Watch until the end, because what follows will remind you that sometimes our deepest wounds lead us to our truest connections. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The train rattled against its tracks as it pushed through the January blizzard, each car swaying under the assault of Montana's unforgiving winter. Inside the last passenger car, Sarah Jean Mitchell clutched her sleeping 6-month-old daughter Lily to her chest, rocking gently with the motion to keep the child from waking. Outside, nothing but white stretched for miles, occasionally broken by the dark smudge of pine trees bent beneath the weight of snow. "Not much longer now, little one," Sarah whispered, her breath visible even inside the drafty car. "Pinewood Valley is just beyond this pass." Tiny Lily stirred, her rosebud mouth, making small sucking motions in her sleep. Sarah smiled, though the expression didn't quite reach her eyes. Those remained fixed on the window, watchful and wary. At 24, Sarah's face held a beauty that couldn't be disguised by the exhaustion etched into its corners. High cheekbones, full lips, and eyes the same startling shade of amber as autumn leaves. But there was something else there, too. A guardedness, a careful calculation behind every movement. The letter tucked inside her coat pocket crinkled as she shifted Lily to her other arm. That letter, written in a steady hand with careful penmanship, had promised her something she'd long given up hoping for: stability. James Cooper, owner of the town's only hotel, had written with such conviction. They had corresponded for 4 months, him describing the growing frontier town of Pinewood Valley, her sharing carefully edited stories of her life in Philadelphia. They had an agreement, not born of passion, but of practicality. She would come west as his bride, help him run the hotel, and in exchange she and Lily would have a home. What she hadn't mentioned was Lily. The decision had gnawed at her for weeks, but with each passing day in Philadelphia, as the whispers about poor Sarah Mitchell and her fatherless child grew louder, her options had dwindled. Her parents' deaths had left her with just enough money for train passage and little else. The teaching position she'd lost when her pregnancy began to show wasn't an option anymore. And the father of her child, well, that chapter had closed the moment he'd handed her enough money for a doctor who took care of such problems and told her never to contact him again. She hadn't used the money for that. Instead, she'd placed an advertisement in a matrimonial newspaper, and James Cooper had answered. The train whistle pierced the air, startling Lily awake. The baby's face scrunched, ready to wail, but Sarah quickly reached into her bag for a small carved wooden rattle. The familiar toy settled Lily, her wide blue eyes, so unlike Sarah's own, fixed on the simple treasure. "Next stop, Pinewood Valley," the conductor called, making his way through the car. He paused at Sarah's seat, his weathered face softening at the sight of Lily. "Getting mighty fierce out there, Mom. Someone meeting you?" Sarah nodded, tucking a strand of chestnut hair behind her ear. My fiancé. He owns the Valley Hotel." "Ah, Cooper's place," the conductor said with a nod. "Fine establishment. Finest between Helena and Butte, if you ask most folks." He hesitated, then added more gently, "Didn't know James was expecting a family." The word family sent a flutter of anxiety through Sarah's chest. She managed a smile. "It's been a correspondence arrangement." Understanding dawned in the conductor's eyes, but to his credit, he simply tipped his hat. "Well, welcome to Montana territory, ma'am. You and the little miss." He moved on, leaving Sarah to gather her meager belongings. One carpet bag of clothing, another with Lily's things, and a small wooden box containing the few keepsakes from her former life. Her mother's cameo brooch, her father's pocket watch, and a daguerreotype type of her parents on their wedding day. The train began to slow, metal shrieking against metal as the brakes engaged. Out the window, the outline of a small town emerged through the curtain of white. A church steeple, the silhouettes of false front buildings lining a main street, lamplight glowing in the windows. Pinewood Valley wasn't much, but it represented everything Sarah had gambled on. As the train lurched to a stop, she wrapped Lily more securely in her blanket and buttoned her own coat to the neck. Taking a deep breath, she stepped onto the platform, the bitter cold stealing her breath instantly. The station was little more than a wooden platform with a small shelter, and as passengers disembarked around her, Sarah scanned the faces for the man she'd only seen in a single photograph, James Cooper, 42, with a neatly trimmed beard and serious eyes. But no one approached her. The other passengers were greeted by family or friends, or strode purposefully toward town, familiar with their surroundings. Soon, Sarah stood alone on the platform, the station agent giving her curious glances as he unloaded mail sacks from the train's cargo hold. "Excuse me," she finally called to him, Lily beginning to fuss in the cold. "Could you direct me to the Valley Hotel? I'm meeting Mr. Cooper there." The agent, a thin man with a shock of white hair beneath his cap, looked surprised. "Hotel's just up Main Street, ma'am. Can't miss it. 3 stories, biggest building in town." He hesitated. "Though, if you're looking for James Cooper, he usually meets the afternoon train himself. Brings the hotel wagon for new guests." Sarah's stomach tightened. Perhaps he wasn't expecting the train given the weather. "Perhaps," the agent agreed, though his expression suggested otherwise. With no other option, Sarah gathered her bags and began the walk toward town, keeping Lily tucked inside her coat as much as possible. The snow had lessened to light flurries, but the cold was bone-deep, the kind that made breathing painful. Main Street was exactly as James had described in his letters, a wide dirt road, now blanketed in snow, lined with wooden buildings. A general store, a bank, 2 saloons, the sheriff's office, and at the far end, rising above the other structures, the imposing Valley Hotel. Even from a distance, Sarah could see it was the most prosperous building in town, with actual glass windows, and a freshly painted sign swinging in the winter wind. As she approached, her pace slowed. This was the moment she'd rehearsed countless times on the journey west, the moment of first meeting, of first impressions. She paused outside the hotel's entrance, adjusted Lily, who had thankfully fallen back asleep, and smoothed her travel-worn dress as best she could. Then, with one final fortifying breath, she pushed open the door. Warmth enveloped her immediately. Blessed, wonderful warmth from a massive stone fireplace in the lobby. The interior was handsome, if simple, polished. Wooden floors, a reception desk, a few sturdy chairs arranged near the fire, and a staircase leading to the upper floors. A doorway to the right revealed glimpses of a dining room where a few patrons sat eating an early supper. Behind the desk stood a man with his back to her, arranging keys on a board. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and even from behind, Sarah recognized him from the photograph she carried. "Mr. Cooper," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. He turned, and for an instant, just a fleeting moment, Sarah saw something like pleasure in his expression. Then his gaze dropped to the bundle against her chest, where Lily had chosen that precise moment to squirm, revealing her tiny face. James Cooper's expression hardened instantly. "Miss Mitchell?" he asked, though it was clear he already knew. "Yes," Sarah stepped forward. "I apologize for arriving unannounced. I expected you might meet the train, but with the weather, you didn't mention a child in your letters," he interrupted, his voice flat. The few guests in the lobby glanced over, interest piqued by the exchange. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she kept her chin lifted. "I didn't. No. This is my daughter, Lily." "Your daughter." The words were clipped, final. "And her father, Sarah swallowed. Not in the picture. Cooper's mouth thinned to a hard line. He was handsome in a conventional way, his dark hair beginning to grey at the temples, his posture military straight, but any appeal was erased by the coldness in his eyes. "Our arrangement," he said, voice lowered now, "was clear. I need a wife to help run this hotel, to maintain its respectable reputation, not a ready-made family with a—" He cut himself off, but the word hung unspoken between them. "Bastard." "Lily is only 6 months old," Sarah said, desperation creeping into her voice. "She won't be any trouble. I can work just as we arranged. She's a good baby, quiet most of the time. That's not the point." Cooper's gaze flicked to the lobby where several guests were now openly watching. "The point is that you misrepresented yourself, Miss Mitchell, and in doing so, you've wasted both our time." Lily began to cry then, a tiny mewling sound that seemed to confirm Cooper's assessment. Sarah instinctively began swaying, the gentle motion that usually soothed her daughter. "Please," she said, the word costing her more pride than she thought she had left. "We've traveled so far, at least let us stay the night. I'll figure something out tomorrow." Something that might have been pity flickered across Cooper's face. "There's a boarding house on Cedar Street. Widow Parker runs it. Tell her I sent you. She'll give you a room for the night." He reached into his pocket and extracted a few coins. This should cover it. Sarah stared at the offered money, humiliation burning through her. "I don't need charity, Mr. Cooper, just the job you promised." "That job," he said firmly, "was for a single woman without encumbrances, not—" His gaze dropped to Lily again. "I run a respectable establishment, Miss Mitchell. My guests expect a certain standard." A woman emerged from the dining room. Then, tall, blonde, and impeccably dressed, she approached Cooper with a proprietary air. "James, is everything all right? We're waiting to discuss the spring renovations." Cooper's manner changed instantly, becoming deferential. "Mrs. Whitfield, yes, of course. I was just directing this young lady to appropriate lodgings." Mrs. Whitfield's cool blue eyes assessed Sarah and Lily, understanding the situation immediately. "I see." Her gaze lingered on Lily, whose cries had subsided to whimpers. "Perhaps the church mission would be more suitable. They often take in cases like these." Sarah felt something snap inside her. "My daughter and I are not a case, madam. We are simply travelers who will be moving on." She turned back to Cooper. "Thank you for your directions, Mr. Cooper. I wish you luck finding a wife who meets your exacting standards." With that, she turned and walked out, the weight of stairs following her into the cold. Outside, the snow had started again in earnest, fat flakes obscuring her vision as tears threatened. She would not cry. Not here. Not where anyone could see. She had weathered worse than James Cooper and his tidy, respectable hotel. But as she stood on the boardwalk, the reality of her situation sank in. Night was falling, the temperature was dropping. She had a hungry infant, almost no money, and nowhere to go in a town where her introduction had been a public humiliation. For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, true fear gripped her. A gust of wind cut through her coat, and Lily began to cry in earnest. "Shh, sweet girl," Sarah murmured, ducking into the narrow alley between the hotel and the adjacent building to shelter from the wind. "Mama's here. Mama will figure this out." But her voice broke on the last words, betraying the lie. She leaned against the rough wooden wall of the hotel, closed her eyes for just a moment, and allowed herself a single, silent sob. "You lost, Mom?" The voice, deep and rough as gravel, startled her. Sarah's eyes flew open to see a man standing at the mouth of the alley, tall and imposing in the gathering darkness, his broad shoulders dusted with snow. Half his face was hidden by a thick beard, but the visible half bore a jagged scar that ran from temple to jaw, pulling at the corner of one's startlingly blue eye. Instinctively, Sarah clutched Lily closer. "I'm fine," she said automatically. Just getting my bearings. The man didn't move. Something about his stillness reminded Sarah of the wolves she'd glimpsed from the train window, watchful, patient, dangerous. He wore a fur-lined buckskin coat, leather trousers, and boots that had seen hard use. A trapper, she guessed, or maybe a hunter. "Bearings are hard to get in a blizzard," he said finally. His voice was deep, but unexpectedly gentle. "Especially with a little one." Lily had quieted at the new voice, her wet eyes peering curiously toward the stranger. Sarah straightened, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. "We're just on our way to the boarding house." "Parker's place?" he asked. When Sarah nodded, he frowned. "That's clear across town, not a good night for that walk." Before Sarah could respond, the hotel door opened, spilling golden light into the alley. James Cooper's silhouette appeared, his voice calling out, "Garrett, there you are! Got those pelts you promised?" The stranger, Garrett, didn't take his eyes off Sarah. "Tomorrow," he called back, "too heavy in this snow." Cooper appeared ready to argue, then noticed Sarah. His expression hardened. "Miss Mitchell, I thought you were on your way to Parker's." "She is," Garrett said before Sarah could speak. "I'm escorting her." Cooper looked between them, confusion giving way to understanding, then dismissal. "Suit yourself," he said with a shrug, then retreated inside. Garrett turned back to Sarah, and in the brief illumination from the hotel door, she got her first clear look at his face. The scar was even more dramatic than she'd first thought, a pale, jagged line that told the story of a violent encounter. But his eyes were kind, if cautious. "Nathan Garrett," he said by way of introduction. "I know where Parker's is, and I know which streets have the least drifts. No woman and child should walk alone in this weather." Sarah hesitated. This man was a stranger, rough-looking and scarred. But he'd just witnessed her humiliation, offered help without commentary, and most importantly, hadn't looked at Lily with judgment. In a town where she'd already been found wanting, it was more courtesy than she'd expected. "Sarah Mitchell," she replied finally. "And this is Lily." Nathan Garrett nodded, a simple acknowledgement without the pity or condemnation she'd already grown to dread. "Weather's turning meaner. We should move now." As they stepped out of the alley onto Main Street, the full force of the storm hit them, wind driving snow into their faces, the temperature surely below zero. Sarah hunched over Lily, trying to shield her from the worst of it. Without warning, Garrett shrugged out of his buckskin coat and draped it over Sarah's shoulders. The warmth and weight of it enveloped her immediately, along with the scent of wood smoke and pine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I can't," she began to protest. "You can," he said simply. "You're carrying precious cargo. I'm just carrying myself." Despite his lack of coat, he didn't seem affected by the cold, moving through the snow with the sure-footed confidence of someone accustomed to wilderness. They walked in silence for several minutes, Garrett slightly ahead, breaking a path through the deepening snow. "Cooper's a fool," he said suddenly, not looking back at her. Sarah nearly stumbled. "Pardon? A child isn't a burden. It's a gift." His voice was matter-of-fact, as though stating something obvious. "But some men can't see past their own plans to recognize what's valuable." The simple words, spoken without flourish or expectation, of response, lodged somewhere deep in Sarah's chest. For months she'd carried the weight of shame and judgment, from her community in Philadelphia, from strangers on the train, from James Cooper. This man, this scarred stranger with his direct gaze, was the first to suggest that Lily wasn't a mistake to be hidden or overcome. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate for the unexpected kindness. Garrett just nodded and continued forward, navigating them through Pinewood Valley's snow-covered streets toward whatever uncertain welcome awaited them at Widow Parker's boarding house. The Widow Parker's boarding house stood at the end of Cedar Street, a weathered two-story structure with warm light glowing from its downstairs windows. As Sarah and Nathan approached, the wind howled between the buildings, driving snow into drifts that reached past their knees in places. Lily had fallen into an uneasy sleep, but Sarah could feel her daughter's tiny body shivering despite the layers of blankets and Nathan's coat. "Almost there," Nathan said, his voice barely audible above the storm. His shirt was soaked through with snow, but he moved with the same steady determination, never once complaining about the cold that must have been biting into his skin. Boarding house porch offered their first real shelter in nearly 20 minutes of walking. Sarah stamped her feet, trying to restore feeling to her frozen toes as Nathan knocked firmly on the door. A moment later, it swung open to reveal a stout woman in her 60s, grey hair pulled back in a severe bun, sharp eyes taking in the scene before her. "Nathan Garrett," the woman said, surprise evident in her voice. "Wasn't expecting to see you. In town until spring thaw." "Evening, Mrs. Parker," Nathan replied with a nod. "Got caught by the storm, brought someone who needs a room." He stepped aside, revealing Sarah and Lily. Mrs. Parker's gaze swept over them, lingering on the sleeping baby. Unlike Cooper's immediate dismissal, her expression revealed nothing of her thoughts. "Cooper sent her," Nathan added, as if that explained everything. Something flickered in the older woman's eyes, understanding, perhaps, or resignation. "I see," she said finally, stepping back. "Well, come in before you all freeze to death on my porch." The interior of the boarding house was modest, but clean, with a small sitting room to the left of the entryway and a dining room visible beyond. A wood stove radiated blessed heat from the center of the sitting room, and Sarah moved toward it instinctively. "Let me take your coat, dear," Mrs. Parker said, then paused when she realized Sarah was wearing Nathan's. She raised an eyebrow at the trapper, who simply shrugged. "The baby needed it more than I did." Mrs. Parker's expression softened marginally. "I've got stew on the stove. You look like you could both use something hot." "I should go," Nathan said, already backing toward the door. "Got business to finish." "Nonsense," Mrs. Parker declared. "No one's going back out in that. There's a spare cot in the back room. You can use it tonight." Her tone left no room for argument. Nathan hesitated, then nodded once. "Much obliged." Sarah carefully shrugged out of his coat, handing it back with her free arm, while balancing Lily with the other. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." For a moment their eyes met, and something passed between them. An understanding, perhaps, of what it meant to be judged and found wanting. Then Nathan took his coat and retreated to hang it by the door, breaking the connection. Mrs. Parker led Sarah to a small bedroom off the kitchen, clearly not one of the regular guest rooms, but warm and clean, with a narrow bed and a wooden chair. Beside it, "It's not much," the older woman said, "but it's the only room with space for the baby. I've got a crate we can line with blankets for her to sleep in." "It's perfect," Sarah said with genuine gratitude. "More than we could hope for." Mrs. Parker studied her for a long moment. "So James Cooper sent you?" It wasn't a question, but Sarah nodded anyway. "We had an arrangement, a correspondence, but he wasn't expecting—" She glanced down at Lily. "Ah." The single syllable contained volumes. James Cooper has very particular ideas about respectability. Not that it stops him from taking Mrs. Whitfield's money to expand his hotel, never mind where it comes from. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "Mrs. Whitfield owns half the businesses in town through investments. Made her fortune in ways nobody discusses in polite company." Mrs. Parker shook her head. "But that's neither here nor there. You get settled. I'll bring that crate for the little one and some stew for you." Left alone, Sarah finally allowed her. Shoulders to slump. The exhaustion of the journey, the shock of rejection, and the fear of what came next washed over her like a physical wave. She sat heavily on the bed, cradling Lily close as tears threatened again. "What are we going to do now?" she whispered to her sleeping daughter. The train didn't come through again for a week. Her few remaining dollars wouldn't stretch beyond a night or two at the boarding house, and returning east wasn't an option. There was nothing left for them there. Lily stirred, her tiny mouth working in hungry dreams. Sarah touched her daughter's cheek gently. "I'll figure it out," she promised. Somehow. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Sarah quickly wiped her eyes and straightened her posture before calling, "Come in." Mrs. Parker entered with a tray, bearing a bowl of stew, bread, and a mug of something steaming. Behind her came Nathan, carrying a wooden crate filled with folded blankets. "Thought you might want to feed the baby," Mrs. Parker said, setting the tray on the small table. "And yourself, you look dead on your feet." "Where should I put this?" Nathan asked, holding the makeshift crib. "By the bed, please," Sarah replied, finding her voice. He set it down carefully, then straightened, looking distinctly uncomfortable in the small room. His height seemed more pronounced in the confined space, nearly brushing the low ceiling. Up close, his scar was even more dramatic, a ragged line that spoke of violence and survival. Yet his hands, as they arranged the blankets in the crate, moved with unexpected gentleness. "Thank you again for your help tonight," Sarah said, feeling the inadequacy of the words. Nathan nodded once. "No trouble." He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "Cooper's a fool," he said again, echoing his words from earlier. "But he's not all of Pinewood Valley." With that, he ducked through the door, leaving Sarah alone with Mrs. Parker. The older woman watched him go with a thoughtful expression. "Nathan Garrett doesn't waste words on just anyone," she observed. "Now let's get you and this little one fed and settled." As Sarah ate the hearty stew, the first real meal she'd had in days, Mrs. Parker bustled around the room, producing a small porcelain basin and pitcher of warm water so Sarah could wash herself and Lily. "Cooper said you'd cover the cost of tonight," the older woman said matter-of-factly as she laid out a clean towel. "But I'm guessing your plans beyond that are unsettled." Sarah swallowed hard. "That's a kind way of putting it." Mrs. Parker's keen eyes settled on her. "I don't need the money right away. Room and board can wait until you find your feet." Hope fluttered in Sarah's chest. "I can work. I'm not afraid of hard labor. And I was a teacher back east before." She glanced at Lily. Mrs. Parker said non-committally. "We'll see what's what in the morning. This storm's likely to keep most folks indoors tomorrow anyway. Get some rest." After the older woman left, Sarah fed Lily, changed her, and settled her in the crate-turned cradle, where the baby immediately fell into a deep sleep, exhausted from the day's travels. Sarah herself could barely keep her eyes open, but her mind raced with worries about tomorrow, next week, next month. She was still sitting on the edge of the bed, lost in thought, when another knock came at the door. This time it was Nathan again, holding a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Thought the little one might need these," he said gruffly, handing her the package. Inside were 3 tiny garments, soft flannel nightgowns, clearly handmade but sturdy. "They belonged to my sister's boy. He's grown out of them now." Sarah ran her fingers over the simple clothes, throat tight with unexpected emotion. "That's very kind. Are you sure your sister won't mind?" Something dark passed over Nathan's face. "She's gone now, her and the boy's father. I keep a few things at Mrs. Parker's for when I come to town." "I'm sorry," Sarah said, understanding now why he'd spoken with such conviction about children. "Being gifts, not burdens." Nathan shrugged, the gesture dismissive but not unkind. "Long time ago. Storms supposed to pass by morning. You have plans?" The question was direct, without judgment or implication. Sarah appreciated the simplicity of it. "Honestly? No. I spent everything getting here." He nodded as if he'd expected that answer. "Town's not as small-minded as Cooper. There's work for those willing to do it." "I've never been afraid of work," Sarah said, lifting her chin slightly. A ghost of a smile touched Nathan's scarred face. Didn't figure you for someone who was. Good night, Miss Mitchell. Sarah, she corrected. Please. He paused, then nodded once. Sarah, then. Sleep well. After he left, Sarah changed into her nightgown and finally slipped beneath the blankets. Despite the exhaustion pulling at her limbs, sleep remained elusive. Her mind kept returning to Nathan Garrett, his unexpected kindness, the story behind his scar, the way he'd looked at Lily with something like recognition in his eyes. Eventually, lulled by Lily's soft breathing and the warmth of the room, Sarah drifted into an uneasy sleep. Morning arrived with piercing clarity, sunlight reflecting off snow-covered streets with almost blinding intensity. The storm had passed, leaving Pinewood Valley transformed into a pristine white landscape. Sarah woke to Lily's hungry cries, the events of the previous day rushing back as she opened her eyes to the unfamiliar room. After feeding and changing, Lily, she dressed in her second-best dress, a navy wool with minimal travel wrinkles, and ventured out to the kitchen. Mrs. Parker was already there, kneading dough with powerful strokes, flour dusting her forearms. There she is, the older woman said by way of greeting. Coffee's hot on the stove. Help yourself. Thank you. Sarah poured a cup, balancing Lily on her hip. Is Mr. Garrett still here? Nathan left at first light, said he had business at Cooper's, then headed back to his cabin. Mrs. Parker continued kneading. Man spends more time with animals than people most winters, traps up in the high country. Sarah tried to hide her disappointment. She'd hoped to thank him properly in the light of day, perhaps ask his advice about finding work in town. Don't worry, Mrs. Parker said, missing nothing. He'll be back. Always comes to town on the first Saturday of the month for supplies. She dusted her hands on her apron. Now, about your situation. I've been thinking. Sarah braced herself. Despite the older woman's kindness last night, the light of day often brought reconsideration. My eyesight isn't what it used to be, Mrs. Parker continued, and the boarders complain about my mending. I saw your clothes. Nice, even stitches. You handy with a needle? Hope sparked in Sarah's chest. Very, I made most of my own clothes and Lily's too. Thought as much. Mrs. Parker nodded decisively. I've got a room at the back of the house. Used to be a summer kitchen. Got good light, its own entrance. Could work as a sewing room if someone had the skills to use it. Sarah stared at her, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Ah, you offering me work? Work and lodging, Mrs. Parker confirmed. You handle the mending for my boarders, take in sewing from town as you can, and help with serving meals. In exchange, you get the room we slept in last night and meals for you and the little one. The offer was more than Sarah had dared hope for. Mrs. Parker, I don't know what to say. Say yes and call me Ruth, the older woman replied with a hint of a smile. No one's called me Mrs. Parker to my face since my Harold passed 5 years ago. Yes, Sarah said immediately, and thank you, Ruth. You won't regret it. Ruth waved away her gratitude. Don't thank me yet. Town's still going to talk. Cooper's already made sure of that, but I never did put much stock in what people say. She eyed Lily, who was contentedly gumming her own fist. Besides, this place could use some young life in it. My boarders are mostly old miners and the odd traveling salesman. A baby might liven things up. After breakfast, Ruth showed Sarah the former summer kitchen, a square room attached to the back of the house with its own small stove, a large window facing east, and enough space for a work table and shelves. It needed cleaning and organizing, but Sarah could immediately see its potential. It's perfect, she breathed, already mentally arranging her sewing supplies. It needs work, Ruth corrected, but it'll do. Now, I've got bread to finish. You get settled in here and we'll talk more about what needs to be mending over lunch. Left alone, Sarah set Lily on a blanket on the floor and began exploring the space that would become her workshop. Despite the uncertainty still hovering over their future, for the first time since arriving in Pinewood Valley, she felt a flicker of genuine hope. That hope dimmed considerably when she ventured into town that afternoon. Ruth had given her a list of supplies to purchase from the general store: thread, needles, buttons, and a few yards of sturdy cotton. Bundling Lily against the cold, Sarah made her way down the snow-cleared main street, acutely aware of the glances and whispers that followed her. Word had spread quickly about the mail-order bride Cooper had rejected. She kept her head high, focusing on Lily's warmth against her chest rather than the curious stares. Inside Harrison's general store, the whispers grew more audible. "That's her!" A woman's voice, carried from behind a display of canned goods, showed up with a baby, bold as brass. "Cooper sent her packing right quick," another replied. "Can't blame him. Man wants a wife, not someone else's troubles." Sarah pretended not to hear, concentrating on selecting the items from Ruth's list. The store owner, a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, watched her with undisguised curiosity. "You must be Miss Mitchell," he said when she approached the counter. "Heard you're staying at Parker's place." "That's right," Sarah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm doing mending and sewing work there now." "Is that so?" The shopkeeper's eyebrows rose. "Well, we can always use another seamstress in town. Mrs. Henshaw does fine work, but she's particular about what orders she takes." He began tallying her purchases. "Put this on Ruth's account, shall I?" "Please," Sarah agreed, relief washing through her. At least the merchant wasn't refusing to serve her. As he wrapped her purchases in brown paper, the store's bell jingled, announcing another customer. Sarah turned to see a woman in her 30s enter, petite, fashionably dressed despite the frontier setting, with auburn hair arranged in an elaborate style. She paused when she spotted Sarah, her eyes immediately going to Lily. "Well," she said, removing her gloves deliberately, "you must be the young woman who caused such a stir at Cooper's hotel yesterday." Sarah straightened her spine. "Sarah Mitchell," she said firmly, offering no explanation or apology. "Margaret Henshaw," the woman replied with a thin smile. "I do most of the dressmaking in Pinewood Valley." Her gaze flicked to the wrapped packages on the counter. "I hear you're setting up a competition." "Just doing mending for now," Sarah replied carefully, recognizing the territorial challenge in the other woman's tone. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "Well, this is a small town, Miss Mitchell. Reputations matter here. I'd keep that in mind." Before Sarah could respond, the store's door opened again. This time it was James Cooper who entered, stopping short when he saw Sarah. His expression hardened, but before he could speak, another figure appeared behind him, Nathan Garrett, a bundle of furs slung over one shoulder. The tableau held for a moment Sarah with Lily, Margaret Henshaw watching with barely concealed disdain, Cooper rigid with disapproval, and Nathan filling the doorway with his imposing presence. Then Nathan broke the silence. "Cooper, we had a deal." His voice was level, but carried an undercurrent of steel. $20 for the beaver pelts, premium quality. Cooper's attention shifted reluctantly from Sarah to Nathan. "The agreement was for delivery yesterday." "Storm delayed me," Nathan replied flatly. "Pelts are still good." A tense negotiation followed, during which Sarah gathered her purchases and prepared to leave. As she passed Nathan, he gave her an almost imperceptible nod. She returned it, grateful for his solid presence, then slipped out the door. Outside, the cold air was a relief after the stifling atmosphere in the store. Sarah took a deep breath, adjusting Lily more securely in her arms. "Miss Mitchell," she turned to find Margaret Henshaw following her out, pulling on her gloves with precise movements. "Mrs. Henshaw," Sarah acknowledged warily. "A word of advice." The dressmaker said, her voice lowered. Nathan Garrett may seem like a safe ally, but he carries his own reputation in this town. His history isn't something a woman in your position should associate with." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" Margaret leaned closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "That scar didn't come from a bear or mountain lion, as he lets people believe. It came from a knife during a fight that left another man dead." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "I don't believe in judging people based on rumors." "It's not a rumor," Margaret replied coolly. "It's why he lives, alone in the mountains instead of among civilized folk. Some say he should have been hanged for what he did." With that parting statement, she turned and walked away, leaving Sarah standing in the snow, clutching her packages and her baby, wondering what dark history lay behind Nathan Garrett's scarred face, and why, despite the warning, she felt more drawn to him than ever. The following week passed in a blur of activity as Sarah established her new routine at Ruth's boarding house. The former summer kitchen had been transformed into a functional sewing room, with her meager supplies arranged neatly on shelves Ruth's handyman had installed. A cradle fashioned from a sturdy fruit crate sat beside her work table where Lily could nap while Sarah tended to her growing pile of mending. Word had spread through Pinewood Valley about the new seamstress at Parker's boarding house. Despite Margaret Henshaw's obvious disapproval, work trickled in, first from Ruth's regular boarders, then from the miners who lived in shacks at the edge of town and had no women to repair their torn shirts and frayed jacket cuffs. "You charge fair prices," one grizzled old prospector told her as he dropped off a pile of work clothes. "Henshaw woman wants an arm and a leg just to patch a pair of trousers." Sarah had deliberately set her prices below Margaret's, knowing she couldn't compete with the established dressmakers' finer work yet, but could offer more affordable repairs. It was a strategic decision that had earned her quiet approval from Ruth. "Smart girl," the older woman had said. "Give folks good value. They'll forget about gossiping soon enough." But the gossip hadn't subsided entirely. Sarah felt it every time she ventured into town. The stares, the whispers, the conversations that halted when she approached. James Cooper had made no attempt to speak to her since their encounter at the general store, but his cold gaze followed her whenever their paths crossed on Main Street. Lily had become her shield in a way Sarah hadn't anticipated. The baby's sweet temperament and ready smiles charmed even the sternest of Ruth's boarders, and several of the older miners would linger after dropping off their mending just to make funny faces at the child. "Never had young'uns of my own," admitted Chester Bailey, a silver-haired man who'd been prospecting in Montana Territory for 30 years. "But this little lady makes me wish I'd settled down and tried it." These small kindnesses sustained Sarah through the difficult adjustment to her new life. Still, she found her thoughts returning often to Nathan Garrett. There had been no sign of the trapper since the encounter at Harrison's store, and Sarah couldn't help wondering if Margaret Henshaw's ominous words had been true. Had he really killed a man? And if so, what circumstances had driven him to such violence? Ruth proved a valuable source of information, though she parceled it out sparingly between kneading bread and chopping vegetables. "Nathan came here about 7 years ago," she told Sarah one evening as they prepared dinner for the boarders. "Already had that scar, already kept to himself, built a cabin up in the high country, started trading pelts. Honest in his dealings, fair with his prices, that's all most folks needed to know." "And the rest?" Sarah prompted, carefully dicing potatoes while keeping one eye on Lily, who was contentedly gumming a wooden spoon in her cradle. Ruth's knife paused over an onion. "Not my story to tell." Her tone made it clear the subject was closed. January melted into February, bringing slightly milder temperatures but deeper snows. Sarah's small savings from her mending work grew by tiny increments, carefully stored in a tin box beneath her bed. She kept a precise accounting of everything she owed Ruth, determined to pay back her debt of kindness as soon as possible. The first Saturday in February dawned clear and cold. Sarah woke early, nursing Lily before. The baby fully woke, then dressing with more care than usual. She told herself it was because she needed to look professional when purchasing supplies at the general store, but a flutter of anticipation in her stomach betrayed her true motivation. "Nathan usually arrives mid-morning," Ruth commented casually over breakfast, her knowing eyes missing nothing. "Trades his furs, buys supplies, sometimes takes a hot meal at Henderson's before heading back out." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. "I wasn't—" "Of course not," Ruth interrupted with the faintest smile. "Just making conversation." By 10 o'clock, Sarah had bundled Lily into her warmest clothes and headed into town. The snow-packed streets glittered in the winter sunshine, and for once, Pinewood Valley looked almost charming to her eyes. She completed her errands methodically, thread and buttons from Harrison's store, where the shopkeeper had become notably more friendly as her reputation for good work spread. A small piece of smoked ham from the butcher for Sunday's dinner, and finally a precious bottle of milk from the Henderson Farm stand. As she emerged from the butcher's shop, Sarah spotted a familiar figure leading a heavily laden pack-horse down Main Street. Even at a distance, Nathan Garrett's tall frame was unmistakable, his bearded face partially hidden beneath a fur-lined hat. Sarah hesitated, suddenly uncertain. Should she approach him? Wait for him to notice her? Their previous encounters had occurred naturally, without calculation. Seeking him out deliberately felt different, especially in full view of the town's watchful eyes. The decision was made for her when Lily let out a happy squeal, loud enough to carry in the crisp morning. Nathan's head turned at the sound, his eyes finding them immediately. After a moment's pause, he changed direction, leading his horse toward them. "Miss Mitchell," he greeted her, stopping a respectful distance away. "Little miss." His voice softened, noticeably on the second greeting, and Sarah was startled to see Lily reaching toward him with pudgy hands, recognizing him despite the weeks since their last meeting. "Mr. Garrett," Sarah replied, unable to suppress a smile. "Welcome back to civilization." Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. "Such as it is." He nodded toward her parcels. "Successful morning?" "Very. And you?" "Decent. Hunting enough to trade for supplies?" His gaze moved to Lily again, who was still watching him with fascination. "She's grown." "Babies tend to do that," Sarah said, then immediately regretted the flippant tone. "I mean, yes, she's getting bigger every day." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with unasked questions. Finally, Nathan cleared his throat. "Heard you're working at Parker's now." "Sewing." "Yes, Ruth, Mrs. Parker has been very kind." Sarah shifted Lily to her other arm. "The work is steady, if modest." Nathan nodded, seeming genuinely pleased. "Good. Town needs skilled hands." He hesitated, then added, "How are folks treating you?" The question carried deeper meaning. They both knew it. Sarah considered deflecting, offering a polite platitude, but something in Nathan's direct gaze invited honesty. "Some better than others," she admitted. "Most are coming around, but there are still whispers." She paused, then added, "Mrs. Henshaw seems particularly determined to remind everyone of my circumstances." Nathan's expression darkened slightly. "Margaret Henshaw carries her own burdens, makes her quick to judge others." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, a sharp voice interrupted them. Well, what a charming scene. James Cooper stood a few yards away, his expression cool as he observed them. Beside him stood Mrs. Whitfield, the elegant woman from the hotel, her fur-trimmed coat, and hat marking her as one of the wealthier residents of Pinewood Valley. "Mr. Cooper," Sarah acknowledged stiffly. "Mrs. Whitfield." Nathan simply nodded, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly. shoulders straightening, feet planted more firmly, as if preparing for confrontation. "Garrett," Cooper said, his tone clipped. "I thought you'd be at Harrison's by now. We've business to discuss." "On my way there," Nathan replied evenly. Mrs. Whitfield's assessing gaze moved between Sarah and Nathan, lingering on Lily with undisguised curiosity. "So this is the young woman who caused such a stir at your hotel, James." Her voice carried the refined accent of someone educated in Eastern finishing schools. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." "Sarah Mitchell," Sarah supplied, lifting her chin slightly. "And my daughter Lily." "Vivian Whitfield," the woman replied. "I own several properties in Pinewood Valley." The statement was delivered as if it should impress or intimidate, "including partnership in Mr. Cooper's establishment." "How fortunate for Mr. Cooper," Sarah replied, keeping her tone neutral. Vivian's perfectly arched eyebrows rose slightly. "Indeed, though I must say I'm surprised to find you still in town. Most young women in your situation would have moved on by now." The implication was clear. She should have left after the rejection, not put down roots. Sarah felt a flash of indignation. "I go where opportunities present themselves, Mrs. Whitfield. Pinewood Valley has proven more welcoming than initially appeared." Cooper made a dismissive noise. "A few mending jobs at Parker's hardly constitutes opportunity." "Honest work always does," Nathan interjected, his quiet voice carrying unexpected authority. "Something not everyone recognizes." Cooper's face flushed at the thinly veiled insult. "We should continue to Harrison's," he said to Mrs. Whitfield, clearly eager to end the encounter. "The committee meeting begins at noon." "Of course," Vivian agreed smoothly, but her shrewd eyes remained on Sarah. "Miss Mitchell, should you find yourself in need of more substantial work, do call at the hotel. We occasionally require additional help with linens and such." The offer caught Sarah by surprise. "Thank you," she replied cautiously. "I'll keep that in mind." With a final assessing look, Vivian allowed Cooper to escort her away, their heads bent close together in quiet conversation. "Don't trust her," Nathan said once they were out of earshot. "Vivian Whitfield doesn't make offers without expecting something in return." Sarah turned to him curiously. "You seem to know a lot about the people in this town for someone who spends most of his time in the mountains." A faint smile crossed his scarred face. "Animals are easier to read than people, but the principles are similar. Watch carefully enough. You learn what motivates them. And what motivates Mrs. Whitfield?" "Control," Nathan replied without hesitation. "Money gives her power, and power gives her control." Sarah considered this, bouncing Lily gently as the baby began to fuss. "I should get her home for her nap. It was good to see you, Mr. Garrett." "Nathan," he corrected, just as he had that first night. "Nathan," she echoed with a smile. "Will you be in town long?" "Just today. Need to prepare for the late winter hunts." He hesitated, then added, "But I'll be back on the first Saturday in March. Regular as clockwork, Ruth says." The implication that he'd asked about their routine sent a small thrill through Sarah. "Then perhaps we'll see you then." Nathan nodded, his eyes lingering on her face for a moment longer than necessary. "Take care, Sarah." His gaze dropped to Lily. "Both of you." As she watched him lead his packhorse toward Harrison's store, Sarah couldn't help wondering what Margaret Henshaw had meant about his past, and why a man who showed such gentle consideration toward a woman and child would have been involved in a deadly fight. The answer came sooner than she expected. That evening, as Sarah sat in the boarding house parlor mending one of Chester Bailey's shirts, Ruth settled into the chair opposite with her knitting. The old miners had retreated to the smoking room after dinner, and Lily was already asleep in their room. "Saw you talking with Nathan in town today," Ruth commented, needles clicking steadily. Sarah kept her eyes on her stitches. "Yes, he seems well. Ruth worked several rows in silence before speaking again. You're curious about him. It wasn't a question, but Sarah answered anyway. I am. He's been kind to us, but Mrs. Henshaw said... She broke off, unsure if she should repeat gossip. Ruth's needles stilled. What did Margaret Henshaw say? Sarah hesitated, then decided honesty was best. She said his scar came from a knife fight, that he killed a man. The older woman's face remained impassive. And you want to know if it's true? Yes, Sarah admitted. I do. Ruth set her knitting aside, folding her weathered hands in her lap. It's true. But as with most things, the story people whisper isn't the whole truth. Sarah waited, sensing that Ruth was deciding how much to reveal. It happened before Nathan came here, Ruth finally said. He doesn't talk about it much, but when a man drinks whiskey on cold nights, sometimes stories come out. She paused. Nathan had a sister, younger, pretty by all accounts. She married young to a man who wasn't what he seemed, charming in public, cruel in private. Sarah's hands stilled on her mending, a chill creeping up her spine. The sister, Hannah was her name, she had a baby boy, made it harder to leave, as such things often do. Ruth's voice had taken on a distant quality, as if reciting a story she'd heard many times. By the time Nathan discovered what was happening, it had been going on for years. He tried to convince her to leave, offered her a home with him. She refused. Why? Sarah whispered. Fear, most likely. Or shame. Sometimes the devil you know feels safer than facing the unknown. Ruth shook her head. One night, Nathan received a message. The neighbor had heard screaming worse than usual. He arrived to find his sister badly beaten, the baby crying, and her husband drunk and still raging. There was a confrontation. The husband pulled a knife. Sarah's heart constricted, picturing the scene all too vividly. Nathan survived. The husband. It didn't, but by then, Hannah was too badly injured. She lived long enough to make Nathan promise to care for her son. Then she was gone too. Ruth picked up her knitting again, but didn't resume her work. He kept that promise for 3 years, raising the boy alone. Then fever took the child one harsh winter, despite everything Nathan did to save him. The parlor fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, understanding now the pain she'd glimpsed in Nathan's face when he spoke of children being gifts, not burdens. After that he came here, Ruth continued softly. Built his cabin. Far from town, lived mostly alone. Some folks who knew pieces of the story called him a murderer. Others understood he'd done what many men would do to protect family. Either way, he's carried that weight for years now. Sarah thought of Nathan's gentle hands arranging blankets in Lily's makeshift crib, the careful way he'd spoken to her, without judgment or expectation. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. Ruth nodded, resuming her knitting. "Not my story to tell, ordinarily, but you deserve to know the truth, not just Margaret Henshaw's version of it." Later that night, as Sarah lay in bed listening to Lily's soft breathing, she found herself thinking of Nathan Garrett, a man who had lost his family not once, but twice, who had killed to protect those he loved, and who now lived a solitary existence in the mountains. Yet despite that isolation, he had stopped to help a stranded woman and child without hesitation. She wondered what it cost him to see Lily, a reminder, perhaps, of the nephew he had lost. And she wondered, with a flutter in her chest, that she wasn't ready to examine too closely if his monthly visits to town might start to include more than just trading furs and buying supplies. February dragged on, bringing a series of heavy snowstorms that kept Sarah's world confined largely to Ruth's boarding house. Her sewing business continued to grow steadily, with even a few of the town's respectable wives discreetly sending their servants with mending they didn't want to bother Margaret Henshaw with. "Mrs. Davis says you're to hem these curtains," the housekeeper of one of Pinewood Valley's wealthier families told her, delivering a bundle of heavy brocade. She's willing to pay extra for discretion. Sarah understood what remained unsaid. Mrs. Davis didn't want it known that she was patronizing the fallen woman at Parker's boarding house. The request should have stung, but Sarah found herself more amused than offended. Money was money, and her savings tin was slowly filling. Lily thrived despite the harsh winter, growing plumper and more alert each day. She had begun to push herself up on her arms during her time on blankets, and her babbling had taken on more intentional sounds. Sarah treasured these small milestones all the more for having no one to share them with. At least, that was what she thought until the morning Ruth presented her with a small carved wooden toy, a simple bird with movable wings. Nathan dropped. "This yesterday while you were napping," the older woman explained, placing the toy in Sarah's hands. "Said he noticed the little one was getting more active. Thought she might like something to reach for." Sarah ran her fingers over the smooth wood, expertly carved and sanded to prevent splinters. "He was here. Why didn't you wake me?" "Wouldn't let me," Ruth replied. "Said he was in a hurry, just passing through on his way back from tracking a mountain lion that's been troubling the North Valley ranchers." Sarah tried to hide her disappointment. It had been nearly 3 weeks since their encounter on Main Street, and she'd found herself watching the trail leading from the mountains more often than she cared to admit. "Too bad," Ruth continued casually. "He missed the church social announcement." "Church? Social?" Sarah looked up from the toy. "End of February gathering. Happens every year once the worst of winter passes. Whole town comes for food, music, socializing. Reverend Mills announced it last Sunday." Ruth eyed her speculatively. "You should go." Sarah stiffened. "I don't think that would be appropriate. Lily and I haven't exactly been welcomed with open arms by Pinewood Valley's church community. Indeed, her one attempt to attend Sunday services had resulted in such obvious discomfort from the congregation that she hadn't returned. Reverend Mills had been polite but distant, his sermon on the consequences of moral failings a little too pointed for coincidence. "All the more reason to go," Ruth insisted. "Hold your head high. Show them you're not ashamed or hiding." She paused, then added more gently, "Besides, first Saturday in March falls the day after the social. Nathan will be in town." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I don't see what that has to do with anything." Ruth's knowing smile said otherwise, but she mercifully dropped the subject. That evening, as Sarah sat by the fire working on Mrs. Davis's curtains, a commotion at the front door drew her attention. Ruth's voice rose in alarm, followed by heavy footsteps in the entryway. Sarah set aside her sewing just as the parlor door burst open, revealing a snow-covered Nathan supporting a younger man whose face was grey with pain. "Sarah," Nathan said tersely, "need your help. He's hurt bad." "Get him to the kitchen table," Ruth commanded, her authoritative tone leaving no room for questions. "Sarah, fetch my medicine box from the pantry and check on Lily." Sarah hurried. To comply, heart pounding. A quick glance into her room confirmed Lily was still sleeping peacefully, undisturbed by the commotion. She retrieved Ruth's wooden medicine box, a substantial chest containing herbs, tinctures, and basic medical supplies, and rushed to the kitchen. Nathan and Ruth had already laid the injured man on the large oak table. He was young, perhaps 20, with a shock of sandy hair now matted with blood from a gash across his forehead. But it was his leg that drew Sarah's attention. The left pant leg had been roughly cut away, revealing a jagged wound that ran from knee to mid-calf. "Mountain lion," Nathan explained tersely as he cut away more fabric. "Got separated during the tracking job. Found him about 3 miles out." "Why not take him to Dr. Foster?" Sarah asked, setting down the medicine box. "Foster's gone to the Madison Ranch," Ruth replied, opening the box and extracting several bottles. "Baby coming, won't be back till morning." The injured man groaned, his eyes fluttering open. "It hurts," he mumbled. "God, it hurts." "I know, son," Ruth said, her voice gentler. "We're going to help you," she turned to Sarah. "Heat water, lots of it, and find my good sewing needles, the small ones." Sarah moved quickly, stoking the kitchen stove and setting the largest kettle to boil. As she worked, she watched Ruth and Nathan with the injured man. Ruth methodically cleaning the wound, Nathan holding the young man steady while speaking reassurances in a low, calm voice. "You've been through worse, Mike. Remember that bear trap incident last year? You were cursing up a storm then." The young man, Mike, managed a weak smile. "That was, different. Still got both legs, didn't you?" Nathan's tone was gruff, but comforting. "Going to have an impressive scar to show the ladies." Once the water was boiling, Ruth added several herbs to create a strong-smelling infusion. "For cleaning," she explained to Sarah. "Then we'll need to stitch him up." Sarah nodded, already threading one of Ruth's finest needles. She had stitched wounds before, not just fabric, during her teaching days in a school where children were often injured in play. "You know how to do this?" Ruth asked, noticing Sarah's preparations. "I've done it before," Sarah confirmed. "Not on something this severe, but the principle is the same." Ruth studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good. Your hands are steadier than mine these days. You'll do the stitching." For the next hour, the kitchen became an impromptu surgery. Ruth administered a strong dose of laudanum to dull Mike's pain, while Nathan held him still, and Sarah meticulously closed the wound with neat, careful stitches. The work was gruesome but necessary, and Sarah found herself grateful for the distraction of concentration, pushing aside the visceral impact of blood and torn flesh. "You've done this before too," she observed quietly to Nathan during a pause to re-thread her needle. He met her eyes across the table. "The life in the mountains teaches you many skills. Some are more pleasant than others." By the time they finished, Mike had drifted into a narcotic sleep, his leg bandaged with clean strips of linen. The worst of the danger had passed, though infection remained a concern. "He'll stay here tonight," Ruth declared. "Can move him to the spare room tomorrow if he's stable." Nathan nodded. "I'll help carry him once you've got the bed ready." Once Mike was settled in Ruth's small sitting room on a makeshift pallet near the fire, the three adults gathered in the kitchen. Ruth poured coffee laced with whiskey, which Sarah accepted gratefully. The adrenaline that had carried her through. The emergency was fading, leaving her hands shaky. "Thank you," Nathan said, his eyes finding Sarah's across the table. "Not everyone would have helped like that, especially a stranger." "He's not exactly a stranger now," Sarah replied with a tired smile. "Not after I've sewn half his leg back together." Nathan's laugh was unexpected, a deep, rusty sound as if rarely used. "Fair point. Who is he?" Sarah asked, cradling her cup. "For warmth, Mike Donovan. Works with me sometimes on tracking jobs. Good kid. Father died in a mining accident 2 years ago." Nathan took a long sip of his coffee. "He's learning the trapping trade. Still makes rookie mistakes, like separating from his partner during a mountain lion hunt," Ruth asked dryly. Nathan shrugged. "Said he spotted fresh tracks. Got excited. By the time I realized he'd gone off trail, the cat had already found him." "Where's the mountain lion now?" Sarah asked, suddenly concerned. "Won't bother anyone anymore," Nathan replied simply. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the kitchen warm and oddly peaceful. After the chaos, Sarah found herself studying Nathan's profile in the lamplight. The scar that cut across his face seemed less harsh somehow, just another part of him, like his steady hands or the quiet authority he'd displayed during the crisis. A soft cry from her bedroom broke the moment. "Lily's awake," Sarah said, rising. "I should feed her." When she returned with Lily cradled against her shoulder, she found Nathan standing by the stove, his hat in his hands. "You're leaving?" Sarah asked, unable to keep disappointment from her voice. "Better check on Mike's horse. Left it tethered out back." He hesitated. "Unless you need help with anything else." Ruth snorted. We can manage, but you might as well stay the night, Nathan. Spare room's already made up, and that storm's not getting any lighter. Nathan glanced toward the window where snow was indeed falling heavily again. Suppose that would be sensible. Sensible, Ruth echoed with a hint of amusement. That's you, always sensible. She gathered up her medicine box. I'm turning in. Been enough excitement for one night. Sarah, check on Mike every couple hours. Wake me if his fever rises. After Ruth departed, an awkward silence fell. Lily gurgled contentedly, reaching curiously toward Nathan with pudgy fingers. She likes the sound of your voice, Sarah explained, noticing his puzzled expression. It's deeper than she's used to hearing. Nathan shifted uncomfortably. Not used to babies anymore, been a long time. Sarah remembered Ruth's story about his nephew. Would you like to hold her, just for a moment? The question clearly caught him off guard. I don't think, he began, but Lily chose that moment to smile broadly at him, revealing her two tiny bottom teeth. Something in Nathan's expression softened. Maybe just for a minute. Sarah carefully transferred Lily to his arms, showing him how to support her head. His large hands dwarfed the baby, but he held her with surprising gentleness. Lily studied his face solemnly, then reached up to pat his bearded cheek. She's fearless, Nathan observed, a smile tugging at his scarred lip. Like her mother needs to be, Sarah replied without thinking. Nathan looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers with unexpected intensity. Yes, he agreed quietly, though courage comes in many forms. Lily chose that moment to yawn enormously, her little face scrunching up in the effort. Nathan chuckled, the sound warming the kitchen. Someone's ready for sleep. He handed Lily back carefully, his calloused fingers brushing against Sarah's in the exchange. The brief contact sent a strange warmth through her, and she quickly focused on settling Lily against her shoulder. I should put her down, she said, her voice not quite steady, and check on Mike. Nathan nodded. I'll see the horses, then turn myself in. Long day. Nathan, Sarah called as he reached the door. He paused, looking back at her. Thank you for bringing him here, for trusting us to help. He studied her for a long moment. Didn't have much choice about bringing him, he finally said, but I'm glad it was here I could bring him to. The simple statement carried more weight than elaborate compliments might have. Sarah felt herself blush and nodded once before retreating to her room with Lily. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having passed during the night. Sarah rose early, having checked on Mike twice during the darkness. His fever remained mild, and he'd slept soundly under the influence of Ruth's laudanum. When she entered the kitchen, Lily balanced on her hip. She found Nathan already there, talking quietly with Ruth over coffee. How's our patient? Ruth asked, taking Lily from Sarah with practiced ease. Sleeping comfortably. The wound looks clean, Sarah reported, accepting the cup of coffee Nathan poured for her. No serious inflammation yet. Good, Nathan nodded. He's tough, should recover well with proper care. And I suppose that proper care will happen here? Ruth asked dryly, bouncing Lily gently. Nathan had the grace to look slightly abashed. I can't take him back to my cabin. Too remote for regular checking, and he can't ride yet. Ruth hummed non-committally. Fortunate I have the space, isn't it? I'll pay for his board, Nathan said firmly, and I'll be back to check on him in a few days. Sooner than your usual monthly visit, Sarah observed, hiding her smile behind her coffee cup. Nathan met her gaze steadily. Seems I have more reason to come to town these days. Before Sarah could process the implications of that statement, Mike's voice called weakly from the sitting room. The moment was broken. They all moved to attend to their patient. The next several days, I fell into a new routine. Mike remained at the boarding house, initially bedridden but gradually regaining strength. Sarah divided her time between her sewing, work, caring for Lily, and helping Ruth tend to their unexpected guest. To her surprise, she found she enjoyed having someone new to talk to during the long winter days. Mike Donovan proved to be intelligent and good-humored, despite his injury. At 22, he had the easy charm of youth combined with the resilience of someone who'd known hardship. He told stories of his apprenticeship with Nathan that revealed a side of the trapper Sarah hadn't seen. Patient teacher, reluctant mentor, occasional prankster. "First week in the mountains, I tried to impress him by tracking a deer," Mike recounted, propped up in a chair by the parlor fire. "Followed what I thought were fresh tracks for hours. Turned out I was tracking Nathan himself, who'd been circling behind me the whole time, watching me blunder around." Sarah laughed, imagining Nathan's stoic amusement. "What did he do when you realized?" "Just said, if I'd been a bear, you'd be digested by now. Then taught me how to really read tracks." Mike shook his head fondly. "He's the best tracker in 3 territories, but he'll never admit it." "He doesn't seem the boasting type," Sarah agreed, working on a dress alteration as they talked. Mike studied her with curious eyes. "He talks about you know." Sarah's needle paused mid-stitch. "Does he?" Asked how you and the little one were settling in when he came by the cabin last month. "Never asks about townsfolk usually." Mike grinned. "Been wondering what makes you special." Heat rose to Sarah's cheeks. "We're hardly special. He just helped us when we arrived, that's all." "Uh-huh," Mike replied, clearly unconvinced. "Nathan doesn't just help anyone. Man's got walls higher than the mountains he lives in." He leaned forward slightly, wincing at the movement. "Yet here he is, coming to town twice in 1 week." As if summoned by their conversation, the front door opened, bringing a blast of cold air and the subject of their discussion. Nathan stomped, snow from his boots in the entryway, then appeared in the parlor doorway, his gaze taking in the domestic scene before him. "Comfortable, Donovan?" he asked dryly. "Getting there," Mike replied with an unrepentant grin. "Miss Mitchell's been keeping me entertained." Nathan's eyes shifted to Sarah, who hoped her blush had faded. "Has she now?" "Just swapping stories," Sarah explained, returning to her stitching with perhaps more focus than necessary. "Mike's been telling me about life in the mountains." "All good things, I hope," Nathan said, removing his coat and hanging it by the fire to dry. "Only the most flattering," Mike assured him with obvious insincerity. The easy banter between them spoke of a relationship deeper than merely employer and assistant. Sarah realized that despite his solitary nature, Nathan had taken this young man under his wing, much as he had once cared for his orphaned nephew. Ruth bustled in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're early," she observed too. "Nathan, wasn't expecting you till tomorrow." "Finished the tracking job sooner than expected," he replied. "Brought supplies for Mike, and these." He produced a small paper package from his pocket and handed it to Sarah. "For Lily." Inside, Sarah found 3 small wooden animals, a deer, a rabbit, and a bear, each carved with the same careful attention as the bird he'd sent earlier. "They're beautiful," she said softly. "Thank you." "Nothing fancy." Nathan shrugged, though he looked pleased at her reaction. "Thought she might like a collection." "She will," Sarah assured him. "She loves the bird. It's her favorite toy." A comfortable warmth filled the parlor as the afternoon progressed. Ruth served coffee and fresh bread. Mike told more stories of their wilderness adventures, and Nathan occasionally corrected details or added context in his quiet way. Sarah worked on her sewing, contributing to the conversation when appropriate, but mostly enjoying the unexpected companionship. Later, when Mike dozed off by the fire and Ruth retreated to the kitchen to prepare dinner, Sarah found herself alone with Nathan by the window. Outside, children played in the fresh snow, their laughter carrying faintly through the glass. "You've been good for him," Nathan said, nodding toward the sleeping Mike. "For Ruth, too. She seems livelier these days. Sarah smiled. They've been good for us as well. Lily and I needed a place to belong. And do you belong here? The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Sarah considered carefully before answering. More than I did, though some in town might disagree. Cooper is still giving you trouble. Not directly, but I hear things. She sighed. The church social is tomorrow night. Ruth thinks we should go, show we're not intimidated. Are you intimidated? She met his gaze directly. I was. Not anymore. Nathan studied her, respect evident in his expression. Good. Will you be there? Sarah asked, trying to sound casual. At the social. He hesitated. Not usually my kind of gathering. Oh. She couldn't quite hide her disappointment, but, he continued slowly, might be worth making an exception, if I had reason to. Their eyes met, the implication clear. Sarah felt her heart quicken. I think, she began, but Lily's cry from the bedroom interrupted whatever she might have said. I should check on her, Sarah said, already moving toward the door. Nathan nodded. I'll be here. The simple assurance followed her as she went to tend to Lily, warming her more effectively than the fire ever could. The next day brought preparations for the church social. Despite her outward confidence, Sarah felt nervous about attending. It would be her first real social function in Pinewood Valley, and she knew eyes would be on her and Lily. Wear the blue dress, Ruth advised as Sarah sorted through her meager wardrobe. Brings out your eyes. The dress in question was Sarah's best, a deep navy wool with subtle black piping at the collar and cuffs. She'd made it herself during her final months in Philadelphia, hoping it would serve for teaching interviews. Instead, it had hung unworn, as no school would hire a visibly pregnant, unmarried woman. You think it's appropriate? Sarah asked, running her fingers over the fabric. It's respectable without being showy, Ruth confirmed, perfect for the occasion. As evening approached, Sarah bathed and dressed with care, arranging her hair in a simple but elegant knot at the nape of her neck. She dressed Lily in the cleanest of her little gowns, wrapping her in a soft blanket against the cold. Mike, now able to move about with the aid of crutches Ruth's handyman had fashioned, whistled appreciatively when Sarah entered the parlor. You'll be turning heads tonight, Miss Mitchell. That's not my intention, Sarah replied, though she smiled at the compliment. Intention or not, it'll happen, Ruth said practically, fastening her own shawl. Best be prepared. They were preparing to leave when a knock came at the door. Ruth answered it to reveal Nathan standing on the porch, snow dusting the shoulders of his coat. He'd clearly made an effort with his appearance. His beard was neatly trimmed, his hair combed back, and he wore a clean flannel shirt under a dark wool coat that Sarah had never seen before. Nathan, Ruth greeted him with poorly concealed satisfaction. What a surprise! Evening, Ruth, he replied, his eyes moving past her to where Sarah stood with Lily. For a moment, he simply stared, something like appreciation warming his gaze. You look, he began, then seemed to lose his train of thought. Thank you, Sarah said softly, understanding the unfinished compliment. So do you. Mike made a sound suspiciously like a smothered laugh, which he quickly converted to a cough. When Nathan shot him a warning glance. Thought you might want an escort, Nathan said, addressing both Sarah and Ruth, but looking only at the former. Streets are icy. How thoughtful, Ruth replied dryly. Isn't it, Sarah? Very, Sarah agreed, her cheeks warm despite the winter chill. We'd be grateful for the company. As they made their way toward the church at the end of Main Street, Sarah found herself walking beside Nathan with Ruth and Mike following a few paces behind. Lily, bundled against her chest, peered out curiously at the snowy evening. I didn't expect you'd come, Sarah admitted quietly. Neither did I, Nathan replied with surprising honesty. But some things are worth doing, even when they're uncomfortable. Like attending a church social. His eyes, startlingly blue in the twilight, met hers. Like being seen with the new seamstress in town, who happens to be the bravest woman I've met in a long while. The simple, direct compliment left Sarah momentarily speechless. Before she could formulate a response, they arrived at the church. Steps where lamplight spilled golden from the windows, and the sounds of conversation and music drifted into the night. Nathan offered his arm. "Ready?" Sarah took a deep breath, adjusted Lily securely in her shawl, and placed her hand on the crook of his elbow. "Ready?" Together, they ascended the steps toward an evening that would forever change their place in Pinewood Valley. The Pinewood Valley Church Hall radiated warmth and light against the winter darkness, decorated with paper snowflakes and evergreen boughs. The simple space had been transformed for the social. Long tables lined the walls, laden with food brought by the townsfolk, pies, cakes, roasted meats, and hearty stews to combat the February chill. A small group of musicians played cheerful tunes in the corner, while couples danced in the cleared center of the room. Sarah paused just inside the entrance, instinctively drawing closer to Nathan as conversation faltered and heads turned in their direction. Despite her preparation for this moment, the weight of so many eyes felt oppressive. "Breathe," Nathan murmured, his voice for her alone. "You've faced worse than gossips." His steadying presence beside her gave Sarah the courage to lift her chin and step fully into the hall. Lily, sensing the tension, burrowed deeper into her blanket against Sarah's chest. Reverend Mills, a thin man with prematurely grey hair, approached them first. "Mr. Garrett," he greeted, surprise evident in his tone. "This is unexpected. You rarely attend our gatherings." "Evening, Reverend," Nathan replied evenly. "Thought I'd make an exception tonight." The minister's gaze shifted to Sarah, Miss Mitchell, and the child. His smile was polite but reserved. "Welcome to our community." "Celebration." "Thank you, Reverend," Sarah replied with equal politeness. "It's kind of the church to open its doors to everyone." Something flickered in the minister's eyes at her emphasis on everyone, but he merely nodded. "Indeed, please enjoy the refreshments. Mrs. Mills's apple cake is particularly good this year." As the Reverend moved away to greet other arrivals, Ruth nudged Sarah gently. "First hurdle cleared. Now for the food table before these old bones freeze." They made their way through the crowd, Mike following on his crutches, with remarkable agility. Sarah felt the stares and whispers follow them, but with Nathan beside her and Ruth's formidable presence behind, she found she could bear the scrutiny. At the refreshment table, several women were arranging plates and serving food. Margaret Henshaw stood among them, her auburn hair elaborately styled and her green dress obviously the finest in the room. She stiffened visibly at their approach. "Ruth," she acknowledged with a nod, "how surprising to see you all here." Her gaze lingered on Sarah and Lily, then shifted to Nathan with undisguised disapproval. "Wouldn't miss your famous peach preserves, Margaret," Ruth replied, her tone deceptively mild. "Sarah, have you been properly introduced to Mrs. Henshaw? She's our town's premier dressmaker. We've met briefly," Sarah confirmed, meeting the other woman's gaze steadily. "Your work is well regarded, Mrs. Henshaw, as is yours in certain circles," Margaret replied with a thin smile. "I hear you've developed quite a clientele among the miners and other working men." The implication was clear, and Sarah felt Nathan tense beside her. Before he could speak, she placed a subtle hand on his arm. "I believe good craftsmanship serves everyone, regardless of station," she said calmly. "Though I could never hope to match your skill with formal wear. Your designs are truly artistic." The unexpected compliment caught Margaret off guard. For an instant, genuine pleasure crossed her face before her cool mask returned. Yes, well, years of proper training make the difference. She gestured stiffly to the food. Please, help yourselves. As they filled their plates, Ruth leaned close to Sarah. Well handled, always better to disarm than confront. They found a relatively quiet corner where Mike could sit comfortably with his injured leg propped on a stool. As they ate, Sarah surveyed the room, noticing the distinct groupings that had formed. The wealthier merchants and property owners clustered near the reverend, the shopkeepers and tradespeople gathered near the musicians, and the miners and labourers concentrated near the punch bowl, which Sarah suspected had been discreetly enhanced with something stronger than the official recipe. Quite the cross-section of society, she observed to Nathan, who stood beside her, his plate barely touched. Town social brings everyone out, he agreed. Even those who don't normally mix. Only time you'll see Cooper and the miners in the same room without a cash transaction involved. As if summoned by his name, James Cooper entered the hall at that moment, Vivian Whitfield on his arm. She wore a striking burgundy dress that must have come from a city boutique, her blonde hair arranged in an elegant coiffure that made most of the local women's efforts look provincial by comparison. Sarah felt Nathan's posture shift subtly, a wariness entering his stance. "Trouble," he murmured. "Cooper and Mrs. Whitfield," Sarah asked quietly. "Cooper alone is manageable. With Vivian, he's unpredictable." Nathan's eyes tracked the pair as they made their way through the crowd, receiving deferential greetings from the townspeople. "She has ambitions for him and for this town, doesn't appreciate obstacles." The cryptic warning puzzled Sarah, but before she could ask for clarification, Lily began to fuss. The noise and heat of the crowded room were becoming overwhelming. "For the baby, I should take her outside for a moment," Sarah said, rising. "She needs fresh air." "I'll come with you," Nathan offered immediately. Sarah shook her head. "No need, we'll just step onto the porch for a few minutes. Enjoy your food." Before he could protest, she slipped away through the crowd, grateful for a momentary escape from the scrutiny. The church porch offered blessed relief, cool, quiet air that calmed both her and Lily almost immediately. "There now," she murmured, patting Lily's back gently. "Better already, aren't we?" "Children always know when a situation is uncomfortable," a voice observed from the shadows. "Their instincts are uncorrupted by social niceties." Sarah turned to find Vivian Whitfield standing at the far end of the porch, a shawl draped elegantly around her shoulders. The older woman held a small silver flask, which she made no attempt to hide as she took a delicate sip. "Mrs. Whitfield," Sarah acknowledged, wary but curious. "I didn't realize anyone else was out here." "The crush inside becomes tedious," Vivian replied with a dismissive wave. "All those earnest conversations about weather and crops." She studied Sarah with shrewd eyes. "You've caused quite a stir in our little community, Miss Mitchell." "That wasn't my intention. Intentions rarely matter as much as results," Vivian observed, moving closer. In the moonlight, Sarah could see that the woman was older than she first appeared. Fine lines around her eyes and mouth spoke of a woman nearing 50, though her figure and bearing remained youthful. "James was quite upset by your arrival." Sarah stiffened at the mention of Cooper. "Mr. Cooper made his position clear from the beginning. Yes, he can be rather rigid in his thinking." Vivian's painted lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Men often are, particularly regarding their public image." "Is there something specific you wanted to discuss, Mrs. Whitfield?" Sarah asked directly, tired of verbal sparring. Vivian's eyebrows rose slightly at the bluntness. "Actually, yes. I mentioned possible work at the hotel. That offer stands. We need someone with needle skills for linens, curtains, occasional garment repairs for guests." "Why would you offer me work when Mr. Cooper made it clear he wants nothing to do with me?" James doesn't always see the practical side of things, Vivian replied smoothly. You're clearly skilled and discretion can be arranged. You'd use the service entrance, work in the back rooms, no interaction with guests. The offer was both tempting and insulting. Better pay than her current situation, perhaps, but on humiliating terms. And Lily? Sarah asked, already knowing. The answer would remain elsewhere during working hours, naturally. Vivian sipped from her flask again. I'm offering you a chance at respectability, Miss Mitchell, a foot in the door of proper society. In time, with the right behavior, your situation might be overlooked. Sarah studied the older woman, trying to understand her motivation. Why would you help me? Something flickered in Vivian's eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or a deeper emotion, and quickly suppressed. Let's just say I understand difficult positions. Women must be practical to survive in this world. Before Sarah could respond, the church door opened, spilling light and music onto the porch. James Cooper stepped out, his expression hardening when he saw them together. Vivian, I've been looking for you, he said, his tone clipped. Reverend Mills is about to make the announcement about the hotel expansion. Of course, James. Vivian replied smoothly. Miss Mitchell and I were just getting acquainted. She turned back to Sarah. Consider my offer. Send word to the hotel when you've decided. As they re-entered the church, Sarah remained on the porch, puzzling over the strange encounter. Lily had fallen asleep against her shoulder, lulled by the cold air and the gentle rocking motion Sarah had unconsciously maintained throughout the conversation. Everything all right? Nathan's deep voice startled her. He'd approached silently, a skill developed through years of hunting. Yes, Sarah replied, though uncertainty colored her voice. Mrs. Whitfield offered me work at the hotel. Nathan's expression darkened. What kind of work? Sewing, mending. But through the back door, hidden away like something shameful. Sarah shook her head. I don't understand her interest in me. Vivian Whitfield doesn't do anything without purpose, Nathan said, his voice low. If she's offering you work, she wants something in return. What could I possibly have that would interest someone like her? Nathan studied her face in the moonlight. Control, maybe. Or information. She and Cooper are planning something big. For that hotel, expansion into new territory. My territory, partly. Understanding dawned. You think she wants to use me to get to you somehow? Because we're... Sarah trailed off, unsure how to define their relationship. Friends, Nathan supplied, though the word seemed inadequate for the connection growing between them. And yes, possibly. Vivian knows I've opposed their expansion plans. The proposed route would cut through critical hunting grounds, disrupt the balance. Sarah hadn't realized Nathan was involved in town politics, but it made sense. A man who lived off the land would naturally defend it against encroachment. Come back inside, Nathan said gently. It's too cold for Lily out here. The warmth of the hall enveloped them as they re-entered, but Sarah noticed an immediate change in the atmosphere. Reverend Mills stood at the front of the room, having just made some announcement that had the crowd buzzing with excitement. Cooper and Vivian Whitfield stood beside him, accepting congratulations from well-wishers. What happened? Sarah asked Ruth as they rejoined their group. Big announcement, Ruth replied, her expression concerned. The hotel expansion has been approved by the town council. Construction begins in spring. They're calling it the dawn of a new era for Pinewood Valley. Nathan's jaw tightened. They didn't even wait for the final vote. Vote's just a formality now, Mike added quietly. Cooper's got the council in his pocket with promises of jobs and prosperity. Across the room, Cooper caught sight of them. A triumphant smile played at his lips as he whispered something to Vivian, who turned to look in their direction. The satisfaction in both their expressions sent a chill through Sarah. I don't like this, she murmured to Nathan. Neither do I, he agreed. But tonight's not the time to fight it. The musicians struck up a lively tune, and couples began forming for a dance. To Sarah's surprise, Mike pushed himself up on his crutches. "Miss Mitchell," he said with a formal bow that almost upset his balance, "would you honor me with a dance? Or at least a supervised hobble around the edge of the floor?" Sarah couldn't help but smile at his gallantry. "Are you sure that's wise with your leg?" "Probably not," Mike admitted cheerfully, "but I've never been known for wisdom." "Go on," Ruth encouraged. "I'll watch Lily." Sarah carefully transferred the sleeping baby to Ruth's experienced arms and allowed Mike to lead her to the edge of the dance floor. His injury made actual dancing impossible, but they managed a slow circuit around the room's perimeter, drawing curious glances from the townspeople. "You're causing quite a scandal," Mike teased as they moved. "Dancing with the invalid." "What will people say?" "They'll say we're both equally foolish," Sarah replied lightly, "but I appreciate the gesture." Mike's expression grew more serious. "Nathan's been different since you came to town. Better, more present." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I doubt I'm responsible for any change in Mr. Garrett." "You'd be wrong," Mike said simply. "Man spent years hiding in the mountains, punishing himself for things he couldn't control. Now he's coming to town socials, carving toys, acting almost human again." Before Sarah could respond, they were intercepted by Margaret Henshaw and her husband, a portly man with mutton-chop whiskers who owned the town's hardware store. "Miss Mitchell," Margaret greeted her with brittle politeness. "How brave of you to join the dancing. Mr. Donovan is an excellent partner," Sarah replied evenly, "even with his injury." "Yes, another of Mr. Garrett's associates." Margaret's tone made the word sound distasteful. "You do seem to attract a certain type, don't you?" Mike's easy smile hardened. "And what type would that be, Mrs. Henshaw?" "The damaged kind, of course," she replied with false sweetness. "Birds of a feather, as they say." Sarah felt anger rise in her chest, not for herself, but for Mike and Nathan. "I prefer to judge people by their actions rather than appearances or circumstances, Mrs. Henshaw. Some of the most damaged people I've met wear their scars on the inside, hidden behind impeccable manners and fine clothing." Margaret's face flushed. "Well, I never—" "If you'll excuse us," Sarah continued, taking Mike's arm firmly. "Our dance isn't finished." They moved away, leaving Margaret sputtering behind them. Mike let out a low whistle. "Remind me never to get on your bad side," he murmured admiringly. "That was downright surgical." "She had no right," Sarah said, still seething, "to speak of you and Nathan that way. People fear what they don't understand," Mike replied with surprising insight. "Nathan's different, doesn't play by their rules, makes them nervous." As they completed their circuit of the dance floor, Sarah noticed James Cooper making his way directly toward them, his expression determined. Nathan, who had been watching from across the room, immediately began moving to intercept him. "Incoming," Mike muttered, subtly maneuvering them toward Nathan. Cooper reached them first, his smile tight and formal. "Miss Mitchell, enjoying the festivities?" "Very much, thank you," Sarah replied cautiously. "I'm surprised to see you here," Cooper continued, his voice pitched to carry to those nearby. "Church socials are typically family affairs. Respectable families." A hush fell over the nearby dancers, attention drawn to the confrontation. "I was invited by Reverend Mills himself," Sarah replied, striving to keep her voice steady, "and accompanied by Ruth Parker, who is among the most respected members of this community." "Yes, Ruth has always had a charitable nature," Cooper said with a dismissive wave, "but charity shouldn't be confused with acceptance." Nathan arrived at Sarah's side, his presence solid and reassuring. "Something on your mind, Cooper?" "Just clarity," Cooper replied, his confidence bolstered by his recent triumph with the hotel announcement. "Pinewood Valley is on the verge of becoming an important stop on the new railroad line. We're growing, progressing, Our reputation matters. And you think we're damaging that reputation? Sarah asked directly. Cooper's gaze flicked to Lily, sleeping peacefully in Ruth's arms across the room. I think there are standards of behavior that define civilized communities, boundaries that separate us from wilderness. His gaze shifted meaningfully to Nathan as he spoke the last word. The implication was clear. Nathan, with his scarred face and mountain ways, represented the wilderness Cooper sought to tame. Interesting perspective, Nathan replied, his voice dangerously calm. Especially from a man who built his fortune on that same wilderness. I built my fortune through civilization, Cooper corrected, through bringing order, structure, refinement to this frontier. By now, most of the dancing had stopped. The confrontation had drawn a circle of silent observers, including Vivian Whitfield, who watched with calculating interest from the edge of the crowd. And people like us threaten that refinement? Sarah asked, anger finally overcoming caution. A woman supporting herself through honest work? A man who knows the land better than anyone here? A child whose only crime is being born? Cooper's expression hardened. Your situation is of your own making, Miss Mitchell. As for Garrett, he chose isolation over community years ago. Actions have consequences. Yes, they do, Nathan agreed quietly. And so does ignorance. A tense silence fell. Mike shifted uncomfortably on his crutches, and Sarah could feel the weight of the town's collective judgment pressing in around them. Then, unexpectedly, Reverend Mills stepped forward from the crowd. Mr. Cooper, he said, his voice carrying the authority of his position, I believe we should remember the purpose of this gathering, community, fellowship. He turned to address the onlookers. The Bible teaches us that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. It also teaches compassion, forgiveness, and the recognition that judgment belongs to the Lord alone. Sarah stared at the minister in surprise. His sermon the one time she'd attended church had seemed to condemn her situation specifically. With respect, Reverend, Cooper began, standards must be maintained. Indeed they must, the Reverend interrupted. Standards of charity, kindness, and welcome. Miss Mitchell and her child are guests in God's house tonight, as are Mr. Garrett and Mr. Donovan. I would remind everyone that the same Jesus who dined with tax collectors and sinners also said, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." A murmur ran through the crowd. Vivian Whitfield's expression had turned thunderous, while Cooper looked as if he'd swallowed something sour. Now, the Reverend continued, clapping his hands briskly, I believe Mrs. Mills's apple cake is waiting to be served. Musicians, if you please. As the music hesitantly resumed and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself standing with Nathan in a small bubble of space, the tension still crackling around them. That was unexpected, she murmured. Mills has always been more bark than bite, Nathan replied quietly. And he dislikes Cooper almost as much as I do. Sarah glanced toward the Reverend, who was now chatting amicably with Ruth. Still, it was brave of him to speak up. Not as brave as you, Nathan said, his voice dropping so only she could hear. Standing your ground like that. His blue eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, Sarah forgot the crowded room, the whispers, everything, except the man before her who looked at her not with judgment, but with something far more dangerous, admiration, respect, and something deeper she wasn't ready to name. Sarah, he began, then stopped as a commotion erupted near the church entrance. A young man burst through the doors, snow coating his jacket, his face flushed with cold and exertion. Fire! He shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. Fire! At Parker's boarding house. Lily! Sarah's heart seized with terror as she rushed toward Ruth, who still held the baby. The older woman was already moving toward her, face pale with shock. "Get her somewhere safe," Nathan commanded, already striding toward the door. "Mike, stay with them." The church erupted into chaos. Women gathering children, men rushing for coats and hats. Sarah clutched Lily to her chest, the baby now awake, and whimpering at the commotion. "My things," Sarah gasped, the reality sinking in. "Everything we own is there." "People first, things later," Ruth said firmly, though her own hands trembled. "That's always been my rule." Mike hobbled to Sarah's, sighed on his crutches. "Nathan will handle it. Best firefighter in the territory." Outside, the night sky glowed orange above the rooftops. Smoke billowed upward, visible even from the church at the end of Main Street. A bucket brigade had already formed, men passing. Water from the town pumped toward the boarding house where flames licked at the back section, the kitchen and, Sarah realized with fresh horror, her sewing room. "All my work," she whispered, "all my supplies." "Don't think about that now," Ruth urged, wrapping an extra shawl around Sarah and Lily. "We need to stay back." The townspeople worked with the efficiency of those accustomed to the constant threat of fire. Even Cooper had shed his fine coat to join the bucket line, his shirt sleeves rolled up as he passed water alongside miners and merchants alike. Danger had a way of temporarily erasing social boundaries. Nathan was nowhere to be seen until suddenly he emerged from the side of the burning building, carrying an armful of fabric and small objects. He spotted Sarah and made his way directly to her, face blackened with soot. "You're sewing things," he said, depositing the bundle at her feet. "Got what I could from the workroom before the roof started to go." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "You went in for my sewing supplies. You could have been killed." "Knew they were your livelihood," he replied simply. "Roof's going to collapse soon. Everyone out safely?" "Yes," Ruth confirmed. "No boarders were. Home tonight, all at the social. It's just the building and belongings." Nathan nodded, already turning back toward the fire. "Going to help with the bucket line. Stay back, all of you." For the next hour, Sarah watched with the rest of the town as flames consumed the back portion of Ruth's boarding house. The bucket brigade managed to save the main structure, but the kitchen and Sarah's workroom were completely destroyed. By the time the fire was finally contained, exhaustion had settled over the crowd, along with the acrid smell of smoke and wet ash. Reverend Mills approached where Sarah stood with Ruth, Mike, and a now sleeping Lily. "The church meeting room is yours for tonight," he offered. "We've set up cots. It's not much, but it's warm." "Thank you, Reverend," Ruth replied with dignity. "We're grateful." As the crowd dispersed, heading home or to help the firefighters clean up, Sarah found herself searching for Nathan. She finally spotted him sitting alone on a barrel near the water pump, head bowed with exhaustion, his clothes soaked and filthy. "You should go to the church," Mike said, noticing her gaze. "Get Lily warm." "I will," Sarah promised. "In a moment." She approached Nathan quietly, Lily still bundled against her chest. He looked up at her approach, fatigue etched deeply in his face. "Are you hurt?" she asked, scanning him for injuries. He shook his head, "Just tired and angry." "Angry?" "Fire didn't start by itself," he said, voice low so only she could hear. "Not in this weather, not in that part of the building." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February night. "You think someone set it deliberately?" "No, they did. Found evidence near the back door, oil-soaked rags positioned to catch quick." His eyes, haunted in the dying firelight, met hers. "Someone wanted to send a message." "Cooper?" Sarah whispered, hardly daring to voice the accusation. Nathan's expression darkened. "Maybe, or Vivian Whitfield. Too convenient, coming right after that confrontation at the social." Before she could respond, Sheriff Anderson approached them, his weathered face grave. "Garrett, need to talk to you." Nathan stood. "About the fire?" "Among other things." The sheriff's eyes flicked to Sarah. "Ma'am, best get the little one inside. Going to be a cold night." Something in his tone warned Sarah not to argue. She placed a hand briefly on Nathan's arm. "Be careful," she murmured, then turned toward the church, unease settling in her stomach alongside gratitude that they had all survived. The church meeting room had been hastily converted to accommodation, with cots arranged along the walls and blankets provided by townspeople. Several other displaced boarders were already settling in, including Mike, who had claimed a corner with 3 cots grouped together. "For you, Ruth, and the little one," he explained as Sarah approached. "Figured you'd want to stay together." "Thank you, Mike," Sarah said, carefully laying Lily on the center cot. The baby stirred but didn't wake, exhausted by the night's events. Ruth joined them, carrying a kettle of hot tea provided by Mrs. Mills. "Drink," she instructed, pouring a cup for Sarah. "Then rest. Tomorrow will be soon enough to sort through everything." "I can't stop thinking about Nathan's suspicion," Sarah admitted quietly, "that the fire was deliberately set." Ruth's expression grew troubled. It wouldn't be the first time someone in this town took matters into their own hands. When they felt threatened. Threatened by what? A woman and child taking in mending? "By change," Ruth replied simply. "By someone who wouldn't be cowed or shamed into leaving. By Nathan Garrett starting to participate in town life again." She sighed. "People like Cooper and Vivian Whitfield have controlled Pinewood Valley for years. They don't surrender power easily." Sarah stared into her tea, the implications sinking in. "What will happen now?" "Now we sleep," Ruth said firmly. "Tomorrow we rebuild." Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded Sarah. She lay awake long after the others had drifted off, listening to Lily's steady breathing and the occasional murmur from the other displaced residents. Her mind kept returning to Nathan, his determined face as he joined the firefighters, the bundle of rescued sewing supplies, his quiet anger about the fire's suspicious origin. She must have eventually dozed because a hand gently shaking her shoulder startled her awake. Grey dawn light filtered through the church windows, and Ruth stood over her, concern etched on her face. "Sarah," the older woman said quietly, "Sheriff's here, wants to speak with you." Fully awake now, Sarah carefully extracted herself from the cot without disturbing Lily. She smoothed her rumpled dress, acutely aware of her disheveled appearance after the night's events. Sheriff Anderson waited by the door, hat in hands. His expression was grave, and Sarah felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. "Miss Mitchell," he greeted her with a nod. "Sorry to wake you. Got some news, can't wait." "Is it about the fire?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice low to avoid disturbing the others. "Partly." The sheriff glanced around. "Better step outside." The morning air was bitingly cold, their breath forming clouds in the early light. Sarah hugged her arms around herself as Sheriff Anderson led her a few paces from the church door. "Nathan Garrett was arrested last night," he said without preamble. Sarah stared at him in shock. "Arrested? For what?" "Assault on James Cooper." The sheriff's weathered face remained impassive. "Happened after the fire was contained." Garrett confronted Cooper, accused him of setting the blaze. Words exchanged, then fists. "That's ridiculous," Sarah protested. "Nathan would never—" "3 witnesses saw him throw the first punch," Anderson interrupted. "Cooper's got a broken nose and 2 cracked ribs." Sarah felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "Where is Nathan now?" "Jail cell. Judge Tucker arrives from Helena next week for circuit court. Till then, Garrett stays locked up." "Can I see him?" The sheriff hesitated. "Not usual procedure for violent offenders." "Sheriff Anderson," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady, "you've known Nathan Garrett for years. Is he typically a violent man?" "No," Anderson admitted reluctantly. "Keeps to himself mostly. Never had trouble with him before." "Then, perhaps this situation isn't as simple as it appears." Sarah met his gaze directly. "Please, let me speak with him." After a long moment, the sheriff nodded. 10 minutes. That's all I can give you. Meet me at the jailhouse in an hour." True to his word, Sheriff Anderson admitted Sarah to the small jailhouse exactly an hour later. The building consisted of an office area with a desk and pot-bellied stove and 2 cells in the back, separated from the office by iron bars. Nathan sat on a narrow cot in the first cell, head in hands. He looked up as they entered, surprise, and then something softer crossing his face when he saw Sarah. 10 minutes, the sheriff reminded her, unlocking the cell door. I'll be at my desk. When they were alone, Sarah approached Nathan slowly, taking in his appearance. His knuckles were raw and split, a darkening bruise marked his jaw, and his eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. "You shouldn't have come," he said quietly. "Of course I should." Sarah sat beside him on the cot, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him, but not quite touching. "What happened, Nathan?" He was silent for a long moment. "Lost my temper. Shouldn't have. The sheriff said you accused Cooper of setting the fire." Nathan's jaw tightened. "Found evidence. Oil-soaked rags by the back door near your workroom. Showed Anderson, but he said it wasn't conclusive. So you confronted Cooper directly after the firefighting was done." He was smug, Sarah, standing there with that satisfied look while Ruth's home burned. Nathan's hands clenched. Said sometimes unfortunate incidents helped clear out undesirable elements. Sarah drew in a sharp breath. He admitted to it. Not in so many words, careful about that, but the implication was clear. Nathan finally looked directly at her, his blue eyes troubled. "I shouldn't have hit him. No better than to let a man like that provoke me. But thinking about you and Lily, what could have happened if you hadn't been at the social—" The fear in his voice touched something deep within Sarah. She reached out, covering his injured hand with her own. "We're safe. That's what matters. You still lost everything. Your work, your supplies." "Not everything," Sarah corrected gently. "You saved what mattered most, my basic supplies, enough to start again. And more importantly, Ruth says the main house can be repaired." "Won't help me much," Nathan said grimly. "Judge Tucker doesn't look kindly on brawling, especially not against upstanding citizens like Cooper." Sarah's mind raced, considering their limited options. What if we could prove Cooper was behind the fire? How? No direct evidence. No witnesses. "Perhaps not for the fire itself," Sarah said slowly, an idea forming. "But what about motive? Cooper and Mrs. Whitfield were planning something with that hotel expansion, something that affects your trapping territory. Could that be connected?" Nathan's expression sharpened with interest. "The proposed route cuts through the North Valley, rich trapping ground, but more importantly, critical watershed for the whole region. I've opposed their plans at every town meeting. And suddenly your allies, Ruth, Mike, me, are targeted with a fire," Sarah continued, "the pieces falling into place. It can't be a coincidence. Proving it is another matter," Nathan pointed out. "Then we don't try to prove the fire," Sarah decided. "We focus on exposing their plans for the expansion. If they're willing to burn down buildings to silence opposition, what else might they be hiding?" The spark of hope in Nathan's eyes was worth every risk she might have to take. Before they could discuss further, Sheriff Anderson returned, signaling. "The end of their visit. Time's up," he announced. "Miss Mitchell, you need to leave now." Sarah stood reluctantly. "I'll be back," she promised Nathan. "Sarah," he called as she reached the cell door. "Be careful. Cooper and Vivian won't hesitate to strike again if they feel threatened." The warning followed her as she left the jailhouse, stepping into the bright morning light. Determination replaced fear as she walked briskly back to the church. She would need allies, information, and courage, but most of all, she would need to move quickly. Ruth and Mike were waiting anxiously for her return, Lily now awake and contentedly playing with the wooden animals Nathan had carved for her. "How is he?" Mike asked immediately. Sarah quickly relayed what she'd learned, including Nathan's suspicions about Cooper and the hotel expansion. That North Valley land, Ruth nodded thoughtfully. Nathan's been fighting to protect it for years, says tampering with that watershed could cause flooding downstream where most of the farms are. Cooper doesn't care about farmers, Mike added bitterly, just lining his pockets with railroad money. We need to find evidence, Sarah said. Something that proves what they're really planning, something the town can't ignore. Cooper keeps all the plans and documents at the hotel, Ruth said, in his office. Sarah's thoughts returned to Vivian Whitfield's offer of employment at the hotel. What if I had a way to access those documents? Mike stared at her. You're not thinking of taking Mrs. Whitfield's job offer? Yes, I am. Sarah's mind was made up. It's the perfect opportunity. They want me where they can watch me, control me. They won't expect me to be looking for evidence against them. It's too dangerous, Ruth protested, especially with Lily to consider. Lily is exactly why I have to do this, Sarah replied, watching her daughter play innocently with the wooden toys. Nathan risked everything to help us when we arrived as strangers. Now it's my turn to help him. Despite Ruth's concerns, Sarah sent word to the hotel that afternoon accepting Vivian Whitfield's offer of employment. The response came swiftly. She was to report the following morning to begin work on new curtains for the hotel dining room. Remember, we need documents about the North Valley project, Mike reminded her as they prepared for bed in the church meeting room that night. Anything, with maps, surveys, or official letterhead. I'll be careful, Sarah promised, tucking Lily into the makeshift crib the church women had assembled from a wooden box. The Valley Hotel looked different in daylight than it had on that snowy evening when Sarah first arrived in Pinewood Valley. The imposing three-story structure gleamed with fresh paint, its windows sparkling in the morning sun. As instructed, Sarah entered through the service entrance at the rear. Lily balanced on her hip. Mrs. Whitfield herself met her in the back hallway, eyebrows rising at the sight of the baby. I believe we discussed the child remaining elsewhere during working hours. I'm afraid that's impossible at present, Sarah replied calmly. The fire destroyed our living quarters. We have nowhere else. Vivian's lips thinned with displeasure, but she merely said, Very well, for now, but keep her quiet and out of sight of the guests. She led Sarah to a small room off the kitchen that contained a sewing machine, work table, and stacks of fabric. The dining room requires new curtains. Measurements are here. Material is there. You'll have 3 days to complete the project. I understand, Sarah said, already assessing the room for proximity to Cooper's office. You'll take your meals with the kitchen staff, Vivian continued. Mr. Cooper is aware of our arrangement but prefers you remain discreet. After Vivian departed, Sarah quickly set up a comfortable spot for Lily with blankets and her wooden toys, then began measuring and cutting fabric. The work was straightforward enough, allowing her mind to focus on the real purpose of her presence. Over the next 2 days, Sarah established a routine that allowed her to explore the hotel during her breaks. She learned that Cooper's office was on the 2nd floor at the end of the hallway near the main staircase. The door was kept locked, but the maid who cleaned the hotel rooms carried a set of keys that included access to most rooms. On the 3rd morning, Sarah's opportunity came when the hotel hosted a special breakfast for the town council. Cooper and Vivian were both occupied in the dining room, and the maid had left her cleaning cart unattended while she helped serve the meal. Heart pounding, Sarah slipped the master key from the cart and made her way quickly to the 2nd floor. Lily, secured in a sling across her chest. The hallway was deserted, most guests either at breakfast or not yet awake. Cooper's office was smaller than she expected. A desk, filing cabinet, and map table occupied most of the space. Sarah moved quickly to the desk, rifling through papers, until she found a folder labeled Northern Expansion Confidential. Inside were maps, contracts, and correspondence that confirmed Nathan's worst fears. The planned route would indeed disrupt the watershed, and according to one engineer's report that had been marked not for public distribution, could potentially cause catastrophic flooding to farmlands downstream. Most damning of all was a letter from the railroad company suggesting that negative environmental impacts could be managed through appropriate financial arrangements with affected parties. Sarah quickly tucked the most incriminating documents into the sling with Lily, careful not to disturb the baby, who watched the proceedings with curious eyes. She had just replaced the folder and was turning to leave when the office door opened. James Cooper stood in the doorway, his broken nose still bandaged, his expression shifting from surprise to cold fury as he registered her presence. "I suspected. Vivian's charity might be misplaced," he said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. "What exactly do you think you're doing in my private office, Miss Mitchell?" Sarah straightened her spine, mind racing for a plausible explanation. "Mrs. Whitfield asked me to measure for new curtains in all the main rooms. The door was unlocked." "Is that so?" Cooper's eyes narrowed. "And I suppose these measurements required you to go through my desk as well?" "I did no such thing," Sarah replied, grateful that she'd replaced the folder. "I simply came in to take window measurements." Cooper advanced toward her, and Sarah instinctively backed up, one hand protectively covering Lily. "You know," he said conversationally, "I've been wondering who might have urged Garrett to make such wild accusations about the fire. Now I see the source of his information." "I don't know what you mean," Sarah maintained, though fear was building in her chest. "I think you do." Cooper's gaze dropped to where Sarah's hand covered the documents hidden with Lily. "What are you hiding there?" Before Sarah could respond, the office door burst open again. Vivian Whitfield stood in the doorway, her sharp eyes taking in the scene in an instant. "James," she said smoothly, "the council members are asking for you. Something about finalizing the vote on the expansion project." Cooper hesitated, clearly torn between confronting Sarah and attending to his business interests. "This woman was snooping in my office," he said finally, "going through my papers." Vivian's gaze flicked to Sarah, something unreadable passing across her face. "I'll handle this. You attend the council." After a moment's consideration, Cooper nodded curtly and left the room, casting one last suspicious glance at Sarah. When they were alone, Vivian closed the door and leaned against it, studying Sarah with calculating eyes. "You're either very brave or very foolish," she said finally. "Possibly both." "I don't know what you mean," Sarah tried again, though the pretense felt hollow. "Stop," Vivian said, raising a hand. "We're both intelligent women. Let's not waste time with denials." She moved to the desk, running her fingers along its surface. "You found the expansion documents, I assume? The ones detailing the potential flooding issues?" Sarah's silence was enough. "I thought as much." Vivian sighed, an unexpectedly human sound from the composed woman. "You care for him very much, don't you, Garrett?" The question caught Sarah off guard. "I admire his principles," she said carefully. "It's more than that," Vivian replied with certainty. "I recognize the signs. I once looked at a man the way you look at Nathan Garrett." "James Cooper?" Sarah asked, unable to imagine the cold hotel owner inspiring such feelings. Vivian laughed, a short, humorless sound. "God, no, James is a business arrangement, nothing more." Her expression grew distant. "No, this was long ago. A man much like your Mr. Garrett, principled, stubborn, unwilling to compromise." "What happened to him?" "He died," Vivian said simply, "fighting for those principles he valued more than his own life, more than our future together." Her eyes refocused on Sarah. "Men like that are dangerous to love, Miss Mitchell. They'll always choose their cause over their happiness. Over yours, Sarah straightened. You don't know Nathan. I know his kind, Vivian countered. The question is, what are you prepared to do for him? Because those documents you've found, if made public, would ruin James Cooper and me as well. They should be made public, Sarah insisted. People have a right to know the truth about the expansion. And what about your truth? Vivian asked sharply. A single mother with no family, no home, no prospects beyond menial work? Do you really believe this town will embrace you if you destroy its chance at prosperity, however illusory that prosperity might be? The cutting assessment struck home, but Sarah held her ground. I believe in doing what's right, regardless of the cost. Vivian studied her for a long moment, then moved to the door. Take the documents, she said quietly. Do what you will with them. But remember, choices have consequences for everyone involved. She opened the door and walked away, leaving Sarah standing in Cooper's office, the stolen documents pressed against Lily's warm body and a decision weighing heavily on her heart. By that afternoon, word had spread throughout Pinewood Valley. Copies of the damning documents had found their way to Reverend Mills, Sheriff Anderson, and each member of the town council. An emergency meeting was called, and by evening the hotel expansion vote had been suspended pending investigation. Cooper was livid, publicly accusing Sarah of theft and trespassing, but with the evidence now public and questions being raised about the suspicious fire at Ruth's boarding house, his influence had been severely weakened. 2 days later, Judge Tucker arrived from Helena earlier than expected. After reviewing the case against Nathan and hearing testimony about Cooper's threats and the suspicious fire, he dismissed the assault charges, citing extenuating circumstances and reasonable provocation. Nathan was released that same afternoon. Sarah waited outside the jailhouse, Lily bundled against the February chill, her heart pounding as the door opened and he emerged, blinking in the bright sunlight. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then Nathan crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and without hesitation gathered her and Lily into a careful embrace. You shouldn't have risked yourself, he murmured against her hair. Cooper could have done worse than fire. It was worth the risk, Sarah replied, allowing herself to lean into his strength. For you, for us. Nathan pulled back slightly, his scarred face serious as he studied her. Us? Sarah met his gaze steadily. If you want there to be us. Instead of answering with words, Nathan lowered his head and kissed her, gently at first, then with growing certainty as she responded. It was a kiss that spoke of new beginnings, of futures reimagined, of wounds finally beginning to heal. When they broke apart, Lily patted Nathan's bearded cheek approvingly, drawing a laugh from both adults. She's made her opinion clear, Sarah said, smiling through tears she hadn't realized were falling. Smart girl, Nathan replied, his voice rough with emotion. Takes after her mother that way. Together, they walked down Main Street toward Ruth's boarding house, where repairs were already underway thanks to the efforts of many townspeople who had begun to see Ruth, Sarah, and even Nathan in a new light since the expansion scandal broke. They were nearly there when they encountered Vivian Whitfield, traveling cases in hand, waiting for the afternoon stage. Her gaze lingered on their linked hands, on Lily nestled contentedly against Sarah's shoulder, on the quiet happiness evident in both their faces. So you found your happy ending after all, she observed, no malice in her tone. Not an ending, Sarah corrected gently. A beginning. Vivian nodded, something like regret crossing her features. Perhaps you're right. She glanced at Nathan. Take care of them, Mr. Garrett. Some treasures are worth more than all the gold in Montana territory. I know, he replied simply, his hand tightening around Sarah's, As the stage pulled away, carrying Vivian Whitfield out of Pinewood Valley forever, Sarah leaned against Nathan's solid warmth. "What now?" she asked, looking up at the man who had seen her, truly seen her when everyone else had looked away. Nathan's smile transformed his scarred face, softening the hard lines into something beautiful in its imperfection. "Now we build something new, together." In the distance, the church bells rang, announcing the passage of another hour, another day, another chance for a town and its people to recognize the true measure of worth, not in appearance or circumstance, but in courage, kindness, and the love that transforms strangers into family. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.